our programs, and we're able to hear the clocks chiming the hours in our beautiful building, but right now it is under renovations, and we hope if you are in the area or want to travel, you will come and join us November 9th for our reopening celebration. But tonight we are delighted to have with us as our guest, Dr. Urvashi Chakravarty, who teaches at the University of Toronto. She's an associate professor of English, and she works in the fields of early modern English literature, critical race studies, queer studies, and the history of slavery. Her book that we are going to learn about this evening is the first in the University of Pennsylvania Press's new series on race before race, critical race studies of the pre-modern, looking at fictions of consent, the servitude and free service and slavery in early modern England. A good time to be talking about English history, as we're all aware of the death of Queen Elizabeth today. But I'm so glad you are all here. During Dr. Chakravarty's talk, you are welcome to put a question in the chat or the Q&A at any time. When she is finished with her talk, about 40 minutes, we will moderate those questions for you and look forward to a lively conversation. We're so glad you're here. If you like what you hear tonight and you are not yet a member, we invite you to go to our website and become part of our community. We love engaging with everybody in art and history, literature, and the built environments, and learning more about the world in which we live. So welcome. And I invite you all to join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Urvashi Chakravarty.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the lovely invitation to speak with you today about my first book. It is, as you say, a sort of momentous day, a very odd day to be talking about both English history and the kinds of fictions that England has told about itself over the centuries. So I'm really excited to share this work with you all. Thank you for coming, and I welcome your questions at the end. So my book, which was published by Penn Press in March, and which is called Fictions of Consent, originated in a seemingly simple constellation of questions. Was there slavery in 16th and 17th century England? And if so, what was its status? How did slavery relate to racial formation? And how was English slavery situated within a larger culture of service and labour in early modern England? So, as my book seeks to answer these questions, it traces the construction of a marked and hereditary and therefore racialized form of slavery, and it tries to do this by looking at a number of records and archives. So it looks at the archives of service and family, of apprenticeship and indenture, of classical reception and race, and of kinship and the classroom. And I'll be talking about some of these archives today. So along the way, my book argues that what I call the fictions of consent, constructed in these different arenas, and their afterlives in the context of Atlantic servitude and slavery, anticipate and precipitate the development of a trade in racialized chattel bondage. So essentially this book is trying to excavate the genealogies of racialized slavery and to really make a case for why we need to attend to early modern England as part of that genealogy. So to begin with the first question, what was the status of slavery in early modern England? In order to address this question, my book opens with a famous Star Chamber case of 1638 featuring John Lilburn, where an analogy between slavery and corporal punishment asserted that, quote, whipping was painful and shameful, flagellation for slaves. And this assertion came to construct a truism about slavery in England, that it could not exist and that England was, as we see in this passage, too pure an air for slaves to breathe in. So I take this truism as a kind of jumping off point and perhaps something of a challenge as well, because my book nonetheless traces the forms of slavery in early modern England, and in particular how the fiction of English innocence from slavery was created and sustained. This kind of exceptionalism was celebrated in 1587 by William Harrison, who famously insisted that, quote, "As for slaves and bondmen, we have none." And as recently as 2018, the Treasury in the United Kingdom sent out a Twitter message that, quote, "Millions of you helped end the slave trade through your taxes." And this message reminded taxpayers that they'd contributed to the cost of emancipation and celebrated the fact that, as the Treasury put it, living British citizens helped pay to end the slave trade. So this message glorified the end of the slave trade, but it crucially overlooked the fact that payments were made to enslavers, not to those whom they enslaved. And I think in a particularly horrific twist, descendants of enslaved people may themselves have been paying the bill for abolition. And this message was swiftly deleted, but I think it illustrates the kinds of national fictions around slavery that have persisted over the past several centuries. So it's the roots of these fictions that my book examines, and the ways in which early modern English iterations of service and servitude laid a kind of conceptual groundwork for really pervasive and lasting, as we see from this tweet, narrative and ideological fictions around slavery. So in my book and in my talk today, I argue that we must recover the English Renaissance period as part of this genealogy of English and American discourses of slavery, and as a key site of investigation for the frameworks of race and bondage. So early modern literary and cultural texts, I propose, comprise a kind of crucible for the conceptual architecture that generates early modern England's futures of racialized slavery. So I'll begin today in my talk by tracing an archive of 16th and 17th century encounters with captivity and bondage and slavery, which my book explores over several chapters. And I'll argue for, I think, a quintessentially English and perhaps somewhat unexpected site for the negotiation of racialized slavery, which was the grammar school room. I'll then turn briefly to the role of contemporary captivity narratives in imagining what I term a permanent stain of slavery as a kind of somatic marker that would become written on the body, so that the fiction went, you could discern whether someone was enslaved by sort of viewing their body, and their body was also a way of assessing someone's enslaved status. And then finally, I'll discuss the fictions of consent embedded into really widespread forms of contractual labour and servitude in early modern England. The first is apprenticeship contracts and their kind of legal and contractual successors, indenture contracts, and the role of these two kinds of labour contracts in scripting the afterlives of Atlantic slavery. So through my talk, I'm hoping to offer a sense of the archives and the arguments that shape fictions of consent, and I'd be really delighted to talk about any of this further in the Q&A. So in early modern England's service society, representations of service were ubiquitous. To be a servant was to be socially and legally legible, and that service was frequently imagined as originating not in compulsion, but rather in consent. So the salutary effects of servitude were suggested from Petrarch to the Book of Common Prayer. And the Book of Common Prayer advised that service is perfect freedom. So the opposite of service was not liberty, but bondage. To be a servant signaled civic inclusion, whereas slavery denoted the lack of service. And I want to just pause on this because I think it runs counter to some of what we might imagine about the ways in which service and slavery work, which is to say, slavery is not on a continuum of service. Slavery is the opposite of service. So according to the 1547 Vagrancy Act, someone who was not a servant, which is to say a masterless man, could be taken into slavery, fed only bread and water, and beaten. And he could also be branded on the forehead. And this is a move that I argue anticipates some of the logics, particularly the somatic logics of Atlantic chattel slavery. So this Vagrancy Act was swiftly repealed on the grounds of its harshness, not surprisingly. But the point, I think, remains. far from being too pure an air for slaves to breathe in, England was happy to enforce not just slavery, but a bondage that could be legible and permanently marked on the body. So even though the bondage itself wasn't imagined as permanent, the brand was intended to remain forever as an indelible and perpetual stain of slavery. And this is the term to which I'll return. The Vagrancy Act also engages in a kind of fiction of consent to service, because according to the terms of this act, one has only 3 days to enter service before one is taken into slavery. And in this way, fictions of consent to servitude are also deeply bound up with strategies of making an indelible and legible marker of bondage on the body. So this Vagrancy Act is perhaps one of the most infamous legal rejoinders to the fiction of English freedom from slavery. But in fact, once we start looking for it, we discover that if slavery was almost invisible, it was also everywhere in this period. So early modern readers and audiences had perhaps come across contemporary petitions that circulated to ransom Englishmen captured and bound as galley slaves in Turkey or Algiers. So this is a redemption petition on behalf of one Hugh Mudge, who was taken by an Algerian man of war and, quote, carried into Sally where he is detained under most cruel slavery. This is a redemption petition by a wife attempting to redeem her husband, who was, quote, taken by a pirate, a Sally man of war. So in addition to these sort of more, well, I say informal petitions, but really they did follow a kind of formula for how to buy a subject back out of slavery, early modern audiences may also have encountered the popular captivity narratives that told these slave tales of daring adventure and redemption from bondage, such as this quite famous text, A True Relation of the Travails and Most Miserable Captivity of William Davies, or William Oakley's 1676 narrative of, quote, miserable slavery in Algiers. In addition to encountering all of these textual forms of encounter with slavery, English audiences may also have seen the procession of the redeemed captives that George Glover discusses in his 1637 work, The Arrival and Entertainments of the Ambassador, which also describes, quote, the happy redemption of 302 of His Majesty's subjects who had been long in miserable slavery at Sally in Barbary. In addition to all of these texts, early modern audiences perhaps knew of, and perhaps they would eventually subscribe to, the joint stock companies, which in the 17th century sought subscribers to finance the procurement of, quote, Negro servants to furnish His Majesty's American plantations. By 1680, the tension between the fictions of English freedom and the investment in racialized bondage was so legible and so keen that the English emigre of Richard Molyneux would write to a friend in Oxford that although he wished to bring his, quote, Negro boy back home with him from Montserrat, he was, quote, afraid of losing him because the laws of England admit of no slave there. In addition to all of these contemporary instances, however, my book also calls our attention to the literary legacies of classical slavery and race, and particularly the reception of classical texts in this period and how they come to inform and construct ideas and arguments for racialized slavery. The initial contact zone for slavery in early modern England, I want to suggest, was not just the border or the sea, all of these conventional spaces where we might imagine sites of encounter. Rather, far from being an unfamiliar or a foreign phenomenon, bondage, I argue, actually begins in a really quotidian, really English arena, the grammar school room. And the Roman slave plays and cribs and primers, which we know constitute the cornerstone of the grammar school curriculum, remind us that, to put it very plainly, slavery is actually central to the early modern humanist education. Early modern English schoolboys not only read Latin as part of their grammar school education, they also performed and ventriloquized and vivified authors and plays and stock characters, including slaves. And they would learn by reading aloud and memorizing and voicing all of these different parts and these different subjectivities. So I suggest that part of the schoolboy's Latin training in this period included the pedagogy and the performance of slavery. And it was the very enactment of slavery in the classroom, juxtaposed with the insistence on the fundamental nature of English freedom outside the classroom, that underwrote and authorized the arguments for more fixed and eventually heritable forms of racialized bondage. So the schoolroom becomes a space to learn and negotiate classical and dramatic fictions around slavery, to sort of adopt them for the contemporary strategies of racialized and heritable slavery. So what might the schoolboy have learned about the Roman slave? Amongst other things, he might have learned that the slave was metaphorically marked by the macula servitutis, or the stain of slavery. And this was a figurative stain that induced corporeal effects. So, for instance, freed Roman slaves did not attain the status of freeborn citizens after emancipation, and they could be returned to slavery if, for instance, they failed to serve their patron appropriately. He would almost certainly have understood also that even the common term for a Roman slave, servus, registered enslavement as a kind of enfranchisement, because it denoted someone who'd been preserved from death in battle and taken instead into slavery. So in the broadest possible sense, the classical servus, or slave, engaged a fiction of freedom, because he was freed from death into slavery and then subject, even after manumission, to the mandates of perennial gratitude. So I want to offer one very brief example of how this stain of slavery was encountered and then reimagined in the context of the early modern schoolroom. In the Roman slave comedy, The Eunuch, or Eunuchus, by the playwright Terence, which was a staple of the early modern grammar school curriculum, the lovelorn suitor Phaedria courts his beloved with extravagant gifts of exotic slaves: a eunuch called Doris, and an Ethiopian maid. And these enslaved people are commodities in a classical slave trade, but I suggest they also evoke the spectre of European slave trading. So in a 1627 translation of Terence's Eunuchus by Thomas Newman, we see that the language of classical slave trading has been transposed to an early modern context. In the passage on the screen, having obtained these really expensive slaves for Thais, Phaedria admonishes her for sending him away again. When late you said, this is now Phaedria, you had a great mind to an Ethiop maid, did not I, laying all else care aside, cast out for one? And eunuch too besides thou wished, because great ladies have such creatures. I found one, yesterday gave 20 pounds for it. I'm struck here by the rather anachronistic reference to 20 pounds, for instance, which converts minas into contemporary currency. And so it sort of invokes the spectre of the early modern slave trade by recalling the real economy founded on the sale of humans for pounds. But I also want to call attention to the language of the Ethiop maid, or the Ethiopian slave, who is actually never given a name in the play. So in Newman's translation, as we'll see, she's described as a wench, and she's also described as a wench in another early modern edition by Joseph Webb. But in Newman's version, she is specifically called a blackamoor wench. And this is a really, I think, significant description of this unnamed figure, because blackamoor is a word that has a very particular resonance in terms of early modern servants and slaves. At the turn of the 16th century, Elizabeth I's Privy Council drafted what's called open warrants to remove English blackamoors on the grounds that black servants were depriving white English citizens of employment, and that Elizabeth's white subjects were, as a result, quote, greatly distressed in these hard times of dearth. Now, these edicts were never actually fully finalized or realized, but their rhetoric, which is maybe depressingly familiar to us, plays on the fear of black servants overrunning English households and sort of crowding out white subjects and servants. So the Ethiopian slave girl is at once desired in Terence's play and Newman's translation, but she's also commodified. And in an English context, she disrupts the proper employment of England's servants. But these expulsion edicts by Elizabeth I may actually signal early English attempts to traffic, as Spain does, in the bodies of its Black denizens. And this is an argument that has been put forward by scholars such as Emily Weisford. So in the title woodcut of a 1496 printing of Terence's plays by Johann Grüninger, the Ethiopian slave resembles her counterparts. And on your screen, if you can see the cursor, she's at the top in the middle. But by the early 17th century, as we see in Thomas Newman's translation, she comes to inhabit the signifier of physiological difference, blackamoor, of both unwanted English subjects and early Renaissance slaves. And if we look at the Huntington Library's copy of the Grüninger Terence, we discern a small, but I think quite significant addition to the Ethiopian slave. A reader clearly unhappy with Ethiopis' white visage has taken it upon himself to correct her complexion. He is inked in her face. So in marking Ethiopisa as a blackamoor, an exotic slave who is also a sort of familiar face, our mystery doodler literally inks the stain of slavery onto the face of the Ethiopian maid. In doing this, our doodler also attempts to secure a place, of course, for whiteness as unmarked and unmarkable, and asserts, however tacitly, that white people, even in bondage, are safe from such a stain of slavery, from a permanent and immutable signifier of unfreedom. And this, I think, is a really important move to make, because at this point, as I've already noted, slavery was actually a feature of both European and English trade and of English captivity by Barbary pirates and Turks. Thinking back to this text that I showed earlier. So when Shakespeare's Othello, for instance, claims that he was taken by the insolent foe and sold to slavery, his experience actually echoes the popular redemption narratives of other kidnapped and bound Europeans, which I earlier mentioned. So Othello's redemption from slavery is economic as well as religious. He's brought out of slavery, he converts to Christianity, presumably, but it also signifies his passage from the margins of society as a slave to membership in its community as a servant offering his services to Venice. But Othello is literally commodified by the sale of his body into slavery, and when Brabantio, Desdemona's father, then laments that if such actions may have passage free, bond slaves and pagans shall our statesmen be, he actually links the redeemed and Christian Othello back to bond slaves and pagans. And while white English schoolboys and captives alike may have navigated the sometimes flickering experiences of bondage, slavery was, of course, already linked to racial and epidermal difference. So if we look at the coat of arms that was granted to the English enslaver John Hawkins in 1565, it prominently and very famously features an enslaved African whose arms were bound with rope. And this figure, I think, really explicitly links blackness with bondage. The grant of this coat of arms registered Hawkins' ennoblement. It commemorated his indelible ties to bondage, but this badge of slavery, this crest, far from condemning these connections, instead secured his entry to an upper echelon of English aristocratic status by celebrating them, and it situated slavery at the heart of Englishness. In recording the origins of Hawkins' aristocratic status in the traffic in enslaved persons, this crest attests to the genealogies of Englishness, which is so often hidden in plain sight, and far from suggesting that England has too pure an air for slaves to breathe in, instead it illustrates the really fundamental embeddedness of slavery in English life. And it's in part English captivity narratives in this period that actually paradoxically work to sanction this kind of bondage. As I've noted, English captivity petitions and accounts frequently describe the horrors of bondage and the contingency of manumission. And so they might seem to place under scrutiny the idea of innate English freedom and resistance to real enslavability. If Englishmen can be enslaved, is slavery really racialized? But such accounts actually ratify the ideologies of slavery in order to later secure them with racial difference. So it's this narrative trope of redemption from captivity that's also invoked by, but which is ultimately unavailable to Othello, who is redeemed from slavery only to then be perpetually remembered as, in Brabantio's words, a bond slave and a pagan. So while Othello is redeemed, like so many others in England taken captive, Brabantio's words, and I think the end of the play, underscore how, unlike these other Englishmen and Europeans who come out of slavery, who tell their story, who sell their story, he is indelibly associated with bondage, and his blackness is starting at this period to come to index a more permanent marker, again, a kind of stain of slavery. And returning closer to home, as we recall the Blackamoor wench that I discussed a few moments ago, we note that she is also a familiar figure in perhaps more ways than one. For it's crucial to remember that our word family derives not just from the Latin for household, which is familiar, but also from famulus, a Roman household slave. In my book, I explore the genealogies of slavery that actually underpin the family, and I argue that the family comprises another space where slavery becomes thinkable and even inevitable, but which also provides the structures of heritability which attaches to racialized slavery. So despite the popular early modern tales of capture and adventure on the high seas and in foreign fields, from the captivity narratives I've mentioned to Othello, the slave is ultimately at the heart of the home. And there are several ways of thinking about this, and in my book I also think a bit more about the role of children and heritability, and by generations of the structures of reproduction in securing the futures of slavery, and about the different ways in which slavery underwrites the long history of the family, so that the family and slavery are sort of crucially interlinked. There was, of course, another early modern system that also situated servitude within the nexus of kinship, of bondage, and of education. And this is what I'll turn to in the next part of my talk. Apprenticeship contracts and its Atlantic successor, indenture contracts. The technologies of bondage that enabled emergent forms of Atlantic servitude and slavery were inscribed in the fictions of service which organized early modern labor. And so this is another set of texts and documents that I think are really fundamental in giving us a kind of template for the strategies of racialized slavery, for the rhetorics, even though they might not seem to be, even though they might seem to be a very different kind of labor arrangement. And despite the conventions that dictated these documents, I'll suggest, the sort of deliberate gaps and changes in the printed instruments ensured its manipulability and allowed it to be conscripted into these more onerous forms of bondage. So I'll begin with a late 17th century instance of an apprenticeship contract. In 1683, an apprentice named James Holden was bound to the cutler Thomas Spencer for a period of 7 years. A few years later, in 1688, his brother John Holden was bound to the salter John Purdue, also for a period of 7 years. So these brothers were presumably younger sons, they were excluded from their family succession, and they needed apprenticeships to sort of wend their way in the world and apply their trade. And as we look at these apprenticeship contracts, we see that they were relatively standard. There are blank spaces in which to note names, dates, numbers of years of service to be performed, and the stipulations are fairly standard again. So for instance, these apprentices may not enter into marriage, haunt taverns or playhouses, absent themselves from their said master's service day nor night unlawfully. And in return, the apprentice receives, quote, meat, drink, apparel, lodging, and all other necessaries. So this is very standard. A couple of things I want to point out, however. The first is that the apprentice is also compelled by the terms of this indenture to serve his master faithfully, his secrets keep, his lawful commandments everywhere gladly do. So a servant or apprentice must not only undertake work, in other words, that labor must be willing and it must be faithful. And this is a word that will recur. So The contract of apprenticeship, we're starting to see, not only mandates the performance of regulated forms of labour, it also enforces the enactment of mutuality. So the servant or apprentice needs to undertake work, but that work needs to be willing and glad and faithful. And so what these legal instruments are trying to do is require work that is paradoxically free. As I've said, that is actually not really a paradox in early modern England, because service is already and always understood as fundamentally willing and free, and conversely, to be free is to be a servant. But even though service is perfect freedom, the documents that legislate labour, including apprenticeship contracts, insist on the persistent articulation of what I've been calling fictions of consent, which reimagine even as they deliberately obfuscate the terms and the tensions of servitude. And I'd like to pause here just to talk for a minute about the word fiction, because it refers not just to an act of imagination in the period, but also to a lie or a tale. So by using this term in my book, I'm trying to gesture to the ways in which a fiction points on the one hand to an act of imagining and on the other to deliberate mendacity. So what I'm trying also to demonstrate is the ways in which literary fictions, but also different genres of documents are sort of complicit and can be conscripted into the dissemination of these frameworks of free service. So, while in this indenture, the fiction of consent obtains in the insistence on serving faithfully and gladly, on the performance of contracted work according to an affective framework, as I've said, this contract makes clear how such a fiction also operated in less mutual circumstances. So in this indenture, the usual transaction of service for housing and provision is troubled by a change to the standard terms. The list of provisions to be supplied by the master to the apprentice contains an effacement. And what we see is that the word apparel has been deliberately effaced. Now, apparel would have been almost certainly the most expensive and valuable component of the apprentice's payment. So this erasure actually really significantly alters the terms and the value of what is supposedly a conventional exchange. So for a period of 7 years, Holden is actually having to go without a significant part of his standard recompense. And since meat, drink, apparel, and lodging comprise part of this larger category of livery, this is especially significant. And in the book, I talk about livery, and particularly livery apparel, as a marker of service and servitude that sort of primes us to read the body for the sartorial and later the somatic signs of bondage. So this case of John Holden suggests that even at their most generic, the legal instruments that contract service articulate the fiction of mutual legal protection, reveal strategic gaps and lacunae which raise the really unsettling possibility that the servant may inadvertently bind himself not just into an inequitable contract, but even possibly into servitude. And this is the prospect we increasingly confront when we cross the Atlantic. So I'd like to turn now to the London Record, which is a late 17th century archive of Atlantic indenture contracts, to think about how these documents illustrate some of these pressure points and raise, I think, quite important questions about the meanings and the limits of these contracts. So these indentures, like their legal and material antecedents in the apprenticeship forms I've just discussed, follow printed templates. And again, they have blank spaces in which to note individual information, name, age, master's name, term of service. Sometimes in longer contracts, we get the name of the ship, sometimes the servant's place of provenance, sometimes we get the servant's occupation, often it's just labourer, but sometimes it's a bit more specific. Most of the servants in this collection come from England, and most of them are men. In terms of age, most are in their 20s. Most of the contracts are for 4 years, some are a bit longer. And And what we see again and again, and I think this really fascinating archive, is the way in which the indenture contract is both intended to assert and yet repeatedly destabilizes the very contract to which the hired servant consents. So, like apprenticeship contracts, these indentures are founded upon the premise of mutuality. In one indenture, the servant Thomas Norton is required to, and this is the language of the document, voluntarily covenanteth. So Thomas Norton voluntarily covenanteth to serve in such employment and to be a, quote, faithful covenant servant. So the indenture contract rests really crucially upon volition. The labourer voluntarily covenanteth. But this promise to be a faithful covenant servant raises the question of whether a lack of faithful service or service that's perceived to be faithful would actually invalidate the contract. And as I discussed in the 5th chapter of my book, the answer, at least in some instances, is actually yes. The contract relies on being perceived as faithful. So if you are not perceived to have given faithful service, your contract can actually be extended. Particularly in the case of black servants. The covenant is, however, technically enjoined upon both parties because the master must also covenant with his servant to provide meat and drink and apparel and lodging in an echo of the exchange of the apprenticeship. So both forms of contract, the apprenticeship forms that I discussed earlier, as well as these indenture contracts, explicitly insist on the performance of faithful service in return for the provision of food and drink and clothing and house room. There are two crucial differences, however, between the apprenticeship contract in England and the indenture contract going to the Americas. The first is that the apprenticeship agreement contains at its core the stipulation that the master must teach and inform his servant, in a trade. And this provision legitimates the lack of payment. The indenture contract, however, requires no such pedagogical benefit. The second is this really conspicuous inclusion, as I've said, of the term voluntarily in at least some of these printed indenture forms. And this word voluntarily does not appear in the apprenticeship contract. However, the indenture must include it because, as I'll demonstrate, the agreement to and the sealing of this document does not ensure the operation of volition. So the servant's confirmation that he covenants voluntarily, in fact, paradoxically underscores the potential for the lack of volition. Or, as we see again and again, even in this collection, the indentured servant cannot fully consent to or even sometimes even understand the terms of the contract. So many servants will just make a mark, usually in the form of an X, rather than signing the contract with their name. So in this instance, the X is both a signifier of nominal consent, but also a kind of absence of consent. And in replacing a signature, it apparently offers the mark of an individual, but it doesn't really individuate the supposedly consenting party to the contract. So the X is at its core what I term a fiction of consent that marks a contractual bond even as it undermines its own authorizing capacity. And it also signals, I think, the problem of literacy because the servant can't read the contract. I think it comes to stand in sort of the ruse of the mutual contract, which is seemingly predicated on reciprocal volition, but repeatedly shows its shortcomings. So the X I've suggested is kind of a fiction. There's another sort of problem here, which is that the final master who must actually provide his servant with meat, drink, apparel, lodging, washing in the colony doesn't sign or ratify the agreement himself, because the servant is often bound to a ship's captain or a merchant or an agent who will then sell the contract on. And unlike English apprentices, indentured servants could have their contracts bought and sold without their consent. And they often had little say over or even knowledge of the person they might eventually serve. And this uncertainty, strikingly, doesn't actually affect the efficacy of the contract, but I think it compromises the mutuality which supposedly undergirds it. Even more troubling, I think, are the myriad mistakes in even this limited collection of indentures. And these really underscore how susceptible these documents and the indentured servants who were contracted in them were to abuse. So in one indenture, the servant contracts with himself. In another, the agent ends up indenturing himself. Most troubling of all, however, is a contract binding John Ellis, who was aged 21 years, to a merchant and to service in Barbados. And in this contract, the term of servitude has actually been accidentally omitted. So he's legally bound for a potentially indefinite term of servitude, and yet can only sign once again with a mark, a stark reminder of the fictions of consent that underwrite these contracts. And I want to flag here too, that the interest that structures this gap is that of power and property. And the assonances between the blank here and whiteness registers how the condition of absence or the condition of the blank can speak to a larger issue of racial formation in and through the archive. So let me clarify what I mean by that. The legal instrument of the indenture had been used for centuries to transact and transfer property. In this instance, it's being used to contract indentured servants in England. And it would continue to be used for this purpose within a new global economy of slavery. Thus, in 1709 in Pennsylvania, in an indentured schedule attached to an indenture for the receipt of goods, quote, one Negro boy named Yarmouth was listed as an item and transacted with not only six other men and women, a man named Frank, a woman named Nanny, a man named Black Boy, but also 3 old iron saws, 6 steel bits, 1 grindstone, a parcel of working tools. So in the process, he and the other enslaved people with whom he was catalogued and conveyed were legally and visually rendered a piece of property in a devastating instance of the chillingly quotidian economic and legal business of racialized chattel slavery. I think it's always really horrifying, I think, to look at this list and see that all of them bear the status of item, and to look at that left-hand column and see how they're being described here. In the case of the man named Black Boy, his very name has actually been taken from him. So in part, what I'm asking in this book is, what would it mean to reckon with this document and documents like these, not just within the formal terms of indenture, but as a record of enslavement? How would it reframe this archive or this catalogue? And how can we refuse, or can we refuse, to replicate the work that the blank also at the heart of this indenture, the loss of the name, the loss of personhood attempts, which is instrumentalization of these histories as white property. Only 30 years after the date of this indenture, John Burr of Fairfield, Connecticut, for the consideration of £100, sold to one Thaddeus Gregory, quote, one Negro boy named Robin, about 10-year-old. In this explicit sale of a child, we see that if indentures contractually bound their only nominally willing participants, sometimes they lacked even the fiction of consent, laying bare their workings as instruments of bondage. Meanwhile, in a 19th century list of enslaved persons, we see the echoes of the language of faithful service that we earlier encountered in apprenticeship contracts and indenture contracts. Here, the word faithful is grimly revealed to be conscripted in service of slavery, as the most valuable enslaved person in this list is described as, quote, faithful and trustworthy. Yet, at the same time, as I discuss in the coda to my book by looking at 18th and 19th century pedagogical texts and juvenilia, some examples of which I'll show here, children on both sides of the Atlantic, like their 16th and 17th century counterparts, absorbed the echoes and the fictions of happy slavery. And I'd be happy to talk further about these images and texts if anyone is interested. Earlier in my talk, I suggested that early modern texts located the schoolroom as a space for the pedagogy of bondage and ensured that the future would be rooted in slavery. Apprenticeship and indenture contracts, meanwhile, enshrined the mandate to mutuality, ensuring that as the forms of bondage shifted, the fictions that enabled them endured. So as I've come to the end of this book after working on it for several years and spending a significant amount of time looking at a panorama of these different registers of bondage, I've increasingly come to understand these fictions of consent and servitude not as singular, but as systemic, not individual, but rather institutional. And their afterlives, to return to this infuriating tweet, persist today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There we go. It was a fascinating conversation with a lot to think about, and I am sure our participants, our audience tonight has questions. I invite you all to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. While we're waiting for those to come up, I noticed in one of the last lists that you showed of a list of individuals held as slaves and their value, there were several with 0 and worthless next to them, and wonder what you made of that as you were doing your research.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horrifying list, and I'm always struck by the people who and the scholars of slavery in particular, who have done so much work in these archives, to also think about the toll that this work takes, and what it means to encounter the documentation that's like this. And it's odd because, of course, one sort of wants to talk about the rationale for these estimations without slipping into the kind of registers that authorize them. So I want to sort of flag that problem of doing archival work at the outset. What does it mean to sort of encounter the archives enslavement? What does it mean to think about the records of racial formation as they articulate and diminish the personhood of particular individuals? And in these instances, part of what we're seeing, of course, is in the latter instance, the question of age, right? So how much is one's labor worth at a particular age? There are other ways in which that labor is deemed to be valuable or deemed to be worth less, and some of that has to do with physical capability in addition to age, but I think it's also a really fascinating and horrifying document because of the way in which it's slipping between these different registers, right? So on the one hand, it's giving us sort of a value for these different enslaved persons. It's sort of talking about sort of worthlessness in the terms of valuation, but of course, it's also trafficking in these other seemingly more affective, seemingly more mutual terms, you know, the faithful, trustworthy. And so part, I think, of what is so appalling about this is the slippage between those two registers, and how they become tied to a sort of set of economic values, and how at the same time those economic values are really implicated in sort of the registers of devaluing personhood that whose legacies continue into the present day.
Thank you, thank you. So Francine, this awesome presentation. She sort of read like an attorney doing their opening or closing arguments, and wonders if you believe that people were ever tricked into these contracts, believing they were helping their families, to find out that they were actually being delisted as a human being and relisted as chattel with no rights.
Thank you so much, and I think that is the question, isn't it? So there are a couple of things that that your question makes me think about. The first is that there's work that's been done, particularly by David Sachs and others, about people sort of running away from apprenticeships and entering into indentured contracts to cross the Atlantic. So there is, I think, a kind of how do I put this? Certainly, we have evidence of the sort of fantasy of engaging in these indenture contracts, crossing the Atlantic, maybe having more freedom than one would in an apprenticeship. And a scholar that I mentioned, I think, has particularly looked at this phenomenon in Bristol in the period. The other thing that occurs to me is that it's tricky, because part of what I've been trying to think about is the way in which it's sort of like a sedimented process. We have the apprenticeship agreements, we have the indenture agreements, we have the ways in which these indenture agreements are sort of conscripted then to allow for the transaction and the trafficking of enslaved people. So there's a kind of sedimented legal and contractual history that we need to think about. And part of what I've been trying to do in this book is to recover the genealogies and argue that actually we need to sort of look past the early modern rhetoric of, you know, service and slavery were completely opposed. Of course they were, and yet all of these instruments of service were being slowly and deliberately conscripted to authorize particular kinds of bondage and a slavery that would become racialized. So I absolutely think there was certainly people who were sort of tricked into these contracts. And in fact, there's this whole phenomenon of spiriting in the 17th century. And spirits were essentially agents who would trick servants into indenture agreements and sort of spirit them across the sea. So what we get in the late 17th century are a couple of legal ordinances. And the reason we have these indentures at all that I showed, and I'll just go back and show a couple of them, is because of these ordinances. Because what these ordinances says was that for the first time, one copy of the indenture needs to be archived in a central repository. And so the indentures have two copies, so one stays with the agent, one of them needs to be in this repository. And essentially, it seems to be a form of protection for the servant, but actually it's a form of protection for the agent. So they're not later going to be accused of illicitly spiriting these servants away. And this is, I think, a really interesting instance of a law that seems to protect the servant. But actually, the reason we have these indentures is because the servant no longer holds onto his copy. And in fact, these indentures were used in a couple of legal cases involving spiriting. So this problem of being tricked into these contracts was something that was very much on the mind of early modern English legal theorists, and I would imagine the wider public as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So Dick is wondering, as you said, Nina, so you presented the movement from England to the Americas, and wondering if there was an equivalent movement east to the Indian subcontinent.
So that is, oh, sorry, England to the Americas. Do you know, that's actually, I don't know about that actually. I mean, there was certainly, there are scholars who are doing really, really interesting work on the Mediterranean and the kinds of the trafficked and enslaved persons in the Mediterranean, where people like Amber and Dadaboy are doing really, really wonderful work on this at the moment. In terms of England to the Americas, England to the Indian subcontinent, I have not heard of that in this period. That may have been something that cropped up later, although I'm not sure about that. But certainly there was certainly a sort of trafficking and enslaved persons in the Mediterranean and African context as well. And there are people such as, I mean, I mentioned Professor Dadaboy, Ham Bennett, and others who have done and are doing really compelling and I think important work to think about how what has often been a sort of separate set of questions, one about the Mediterranean world, one about the Atlantic world, how those can be brought into conversation more generatively and I think more productively, and sort of show how these logics and these conversations are part of a global economy of movement and also of bondage.
Thank you. Thank you. Jean, thanks you for your documentation of early slavery in Britain through so many different written and illustrated sources. She found it interesting to see so many indentures you cited seem to be in a register of over 499 pages at the Folger Library, which we associate with Shakespeare in Washington, D.C., and wonders if you can explain something more about this source and if you know why it happens to be at the Folger.
I'm so glad you asked that, because actually it is a bit of a mystery. So these indentures, there's actually only a small portion of them at the Folger, and I believe it's 66. They are part of a larger collection. The rest of the collection that we've retained anyway are actually part of the Middlesex records, which are held in London. And when I first started looking into these indentures, I had several conversations with the curators at the Folger, who are absolutely wonderful, and archivists at the Folger, and we went back into the provenance records and we tried to work out why these 66 indentures were at the Folger. It's such a sort of strange, why sort of separate out this part of the collection, and we really couldn't get to any answers. So I think it's still a sort of ongoing mystery, and it's a sort of weird and wonderful oddity. The interesting thing is Sonia Tycho, who is a British historian who works on early American indenture in part, has actually very recently, a year or two ago, found another indenture in this collection, this time at the Huntington Library. And I don't know, I can't remember now, she's written an article about it, which is really fascinating. And I don't know if she talked about, I don't think she talked about how it got to the Huntington Library. I think we're not quite sure, although I might be misremembering that. But this question of how these 66 indentures got to the Folger is sort of still an ongoing, open question. And the provenance book was mysteriously quiet on tracing how they got there, which only makes me more interested and suspicious.
I think just we have time for just a very brief response to Kathleen, who so she had understood that indentured people held their half of the contract.
Yes, so obviously with the indenture contract, right, we have sort of two halves, and what we get with these new legal ordinances, because we now need to have one copy in this repository, we imagine that the reason we have indentures such as this one is precisely because the servant could no longer retain their own copy, which essentially takes away one form of protection from them. So from a kind of historical perspective, I'm glad we have these indentures. I'm glad we get to look at them. On the other hand, and to study them and ask questions about them. On the other hand, it's a kind of it's a pretty sort of unsettling sort of unsettling archive because of the ways in which it came about. And so even in this collection, you'll see that a lot of the dates are 1682 and 1683, and that's because it's sort of following on right after this legal ordinance that was put into effect.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. And if you want to learn more and spend more time with Dr. Chakravarty's thoughts and arguments, Tess has put in the chat the link to the book and also a code that will give you, is that 30% off, Tess?
I forget. Do you remember how much it was for the code?
I think so.
Yeah, I think it was
30% off. So I hope you will use that. You can just copy and paste those so you have those ready once you get off. We have next week, we have a tour of the Christchurch archives. If you're in town, please register with Tess or online to attend. Our noon talk next on the 16th will be with Susan Gibbs about the hidden history of America's enduring flagship, the SS United States. And please, if you're going to be in Philadelphia on Sunday, September 18th, come to Washington Square at 3 a.m. to 5. We have our second annual Sunday in the Square concert, which is an amazing opportunity to hear wonderful musicians, and also to hear a reading from Philadelphia's poet laureate, so Aria D. Matthews. So I hope you will come and join us for a wonderful time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Chakravarty. It was just such a pleasure to host you at the Athenaeum tonight, and we look forward to hearing more from you and your scholarship in time to come. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this work, and thank you for coming. And thank you for your wonderfully generous and generative comments and questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.